All right, let's get started. So first of all, let me introduce myself, and then I'll introduce the course. So I'm Chris Cutrone. I'm the instructor for the course, and I teach in art history, theory, and criticism, but also in VCS, visual critical studies, and taught here at SASC for 22 years. And I've taught this course from my first year, and I've taught it every year. So you're getting the 22nd iteration of this course. My area of specialization is Frankfurt School Critical Theory. So my other regular courses are on Theodore Adorno, who will be reading in the course, and Walter Benjamin, who will have kind of a cameo appearance in the course. And that means Marxist critical theory. So we're going to introduce some of that today. We won't have a full class session today. We have some in-class readings to go over, but otherwise we'll have our first class session starting next time on the 2nd. What else can I tell you guys about myself? Well, I have a second teaching job teaching social workers, therapists, PhD students. I teach them theory. That's my other little side thing. Sometimes I'll mention them because they have some anecdotes that they provide. I'll sometimes use my teaching experience anecdotally. And what else can I tell you about me? I'm a kind of person active in the public on the left. And my public profile has increased in recent years. So, for better or for worse. Been trying to make an intervention there. Now the course, this is what the department calls a staple course or a meat and potatoes course. So it's a course where we'll be reading, actually looking very closely at things that are often cited but seldom read, right? So it's to provide you guys with a kind of strong introduction and familiarity with some thinkers who are canonical and, like I said, who are widely referenced, but very few people actually read them, and also very few people actually teach them, right? So I've been told by my colleagues, Chris, it's great that you teach this stuff because I wouldn't want to. And there are many reasons for that. So this course is meant to be foundational, but it's also taking us on a certain trajectory. So we'll be basically starting with Kant, and we'll have some explanation for why that would be the case, and we'll be going all the way up to Adorno. So we'll take us up to 1969 when Adorno died. We'll be reading his book, or at least large portions of it, Aesthetic Theory, that he was working on and was only published posthumously. We have 3 authors that we'll be spending more than 1 week on, but then we have a bunch of authors that we'll be doing 1 week quick passes on. So the 3 who we're spending 3 weeks or more on are Kant, Nietzsche, and Adorno, which seems like a kind of an odd arrangement of thinkers, but nonetheless, we'll see how it's justified. The 1 weekers are Schiller, Hegel, and Lukács. And we'll be building up towards Adorno's aesthetic theory, meaning part of the way that I conceived of the course and structured it is what would be some baseline level background reading necessary to be able to even begin to read Adorno's aesthetic theory, although it still is leaving a lot out, this course. But that's just a kind of conceptual conceit of the course rather than the sort of purpose of the course. We'll be talking today about modernism, so what it means to say philosophy of modernism, also what it means to say philosophy. So we'll get into that kind of subject matter today. The formal requirements for the course are do the reading. It's going to be a reading intensive course. It's going to be, no joke, 100 pages a week. Boom, right? Kant, 100 pages. Like we'll do 3 weeks of Kant, 300 pages of Kant. just like that. And all I can say about the reading requirement difficulty is that used to be a slogan that they used to tell children struggling in adolescence: it gets better. It gets better, meaning it might start out, you're like, what the fuck? I can't even begin to understand this. And I'll give you guys some advice on how to read Kant, because Kant's our first sort of steep incline, kind of difficult task between this week and next week. The readings will get a little bit more comprehensible as we go along, a little bit less strange in terms of the prose, the actual text. Schiller, actually, right after Kant, will be pretty straightforward. Hegel will be actually much more straightforward than you might expect because it's lectures. And even the Kant will get easier. It will get easier by way of familiarity, but also the text itself will get easier. And then we'll have some other little bumps along the way, bumps in the road, like first week of Nietzsche is a little difficult, Lukács is a little difficult, and Adorno is a little difficult. But the reading's very important. Coming to class is very important. So attending class is very important. I will be, however, recording the class. I'll be doing audio recordings. I'll post them to a Google Drive folder, so you have that to review if you should so happen to miss class. You'll be able to catch up that way. However, I think in class, like live presence is salutary for focusing, thinking, processing. So those two are like basic requirements, reading and attendance. I'm going to be setting up discussion threads on Canvas where everyone is invited to, encouraged to, but not required to, post a couple of like bullet point kind of reactions to the reading that you'd like to put on our agenda to discuss in class. I will also be taking 2 volunteers each week to present those bullet point notes. So the people who volunteer, 2 people each week who volunteer will be required to post to the discussion thread. Everyone else will be encouraged but not required. And then in class, you guys will verbally present what you'd like us to focus on. And so it's not meant to summarize the reading or be comprehensive in that way. It's really your reaction to the reading, the things that stood out for you that you want to key into and drill down on in class. Finally, there's a paper at the end of the semester, and it will be a paper that is based on the readings. So it's a little bit of an atypical art history class here at SAIC because it won't be a research paper. It will be so you won't have to do any reading outside the readings that we're doing in the course. That will be neither required nor desired particularly. It will be an opportunity for a learning through writing exercise, meaning sometimes you don't know what you think about something until you try to write about it. Right, so in other words, it's part of the processing and educational kind of form of the course, the writing assignment, rather than, and it's essayistic, so it'll be a final paper, final essay, and short, 5 or 6 pages, double-spaced, again, really your thoughts on the reading, rather than a research paper, rather than a kind of academic piece of writing. So those are the formal requirements. Is that straightforward, or any questions about that? Now, we have, my Monday class misses for Labor Day. We have off the full week for Thanksgiving, so we'll have off that week. Critique week, I will request my critique panel be on a day other than my teaching days so that we can have an optional, if you guys are available, class session that week of critique week. That will be basically our schedule. And unlike some other art history courses here at SAIC, we will have readings all the way up to the end. So I know that often it's like 10 or 11 weeks of reading and then like 3 or 4 weeks of student presentations at the end where the professor sits in the back of the room and falls asleep. I actually went to school here as for an MFA. I got an MFA here at SAIC. The culture has changed a little bit, but not all that much in 30 years, in fact. So anyway, we'll be doing reading all the way up to the end. We'll be trying to make full use of the semester schedule to cover as much material as we can. All right, so let me have you guys introduce yourselves, if you would. So just briefly tell me your name and how you'd like to be addressed, and also just something about where you are at SAIC in terms of your area of study or concentration or interest, if we could. Just Mark here.
Hi everybody, I'm Mark. I'm a transfer student in my junior year. I'm here, painting and drawing is my natural habitat. I have a biochemistry background, so my art across the boundaries, biochemistry.
Science.
Yeah.
Cool, thank you. Cameron?
It's me.
Hey.
My name's Cameron. I'm a sophomore studying fashion design.
Cool. Dana?
Dana.
Hey.
I'm currently pursuing my MA in art education here at SAIC. I have a history background in history of art and architecture at UC Santa Barbara.
Santa Barbara, yeah, cool. Daisy?
Hi, I'm Daisy. I'm a transfer student in my junior year-ish, and I'm mostly studying sculpture here.
Cool. Ava? Carolyn?
Hi, I'm a senior. I was mostly in the fashion department, but also some other ones. Sheer backgrounds.
Chantal?
Hi, I'm Chantal. I'm a third year, and I'm focused in the architecture department.
Andrew?
I'm Andrew. I'm a senior. I'm mostly in architecture and sculpture.
Katerina?
I'm Katerina. I'm a grad student in the dual program, so MA in art history, MA in arts admin. I like to study war and political art of especially the 20th century, but I'm trying to branch out.
Zani?
Hi, I'm Zani, he, him, and I'm in the film and photo department, mainly film, and then I also do a lot of music, but we don't have classes here for it, so try to work in the music with the film.
With sound.
Yeah,
Sound. No, it's
but
music.
not too much in the way of like music composition, but yeah.
It's a pet peeve of mine. Well, actually, one of the things that we'll be doing in this course is music. So this course will be a little bit atypical for art history classes in that it won't be as visual art based as much as it will be literature and performance art based. So we'll be looking at writings that address and also or by Schiller was a dramaturge, a playwright, and also we will have two thinkers on our roster who are themselves musicians, and that's Nietzsche and Adorno, who are musicians. So music's going to be a big one in terms of subject matter. Anyway, but my pet peeve is that nobody's a musician anymore. They're a sound artist, and I'm like, no, music. It's music. It's like it's like the music version of the anti-aesthetic, I guess, or something, or the anti-art, or whatever, or yeah, who knows. Anyway, cool. Calvin.
I'm Calvin. I'm a senior in the painting and drawing department.
Lily?
I'm Lillian. I'm third year here, and I'm mainly in painting, ceramics, and the fiber spray.
Kaylin?
I'm Tyler,
Tyler.
and I'm junior year, and I do painting and design object this year.
Designed object,
Yeah.
also. Yolanda?
Hi, I'm Yolanda. I'm a senior. I'm studying painting and drawing.
Valentina?
Hi, I'm Valentina. It's my second year Master of Design and Design Objects, and my background is graphic design. I studied in Moscow State University.
Cool. Marco?
I'm Marco. I'm a transfer student in my junior year, and my focus is painting.
Miriam?
Hi, I'm Miriam. I am an exchange student from the Slade in London, where I do a joint honours in fine art history of art. I think I would be a junior. Is that like the third year?
Yeah.
Yes, I think I'm a junior then. And I work across a range of mediums at the moment, working with video and performance a lot and trying out some sculpture for the first time.
Cool. Welcome. All right. Verena? Hey.
Hi, my name is Verena. I grew up in South Korea. I studied in Yonsei State University in Ohio for BFA as painting major and minor in history of media. And I'm a grad student right now. This is my first semester. My major is visual communication design. I'm not familiar with yet, so hopefully it comes well.
Viscom? Stephanie?
I'm Stephanie. I'm a senior, and I'm in the building project.
Gia?
Hi, I'm GM. I'm a third year. I'm in the arts admin department. I'm primarily a curator, and I also have an extensive interest in philosophy, so yeah, it's pretty exciting to be here.
Cool. Jay?
I'm Jay.
Yeah.
You can call me Jay. I'm a second year grad student in FBNMA. I use he, him pronoun. I have a psychology and sociology background, so my works mostly are about politics, identity, and mostly about Taiwan, because I'm from Taiwan.
Key?
You guys can call me Chi-Chi. This is my second semester here, so I might still be freshman. I do painting and sculptures.
And Timothy? Timothy here. Okay, so we've got 2 absences here, not bad. All right, cool. Thanks, guys. All right, so let's get into, so first of all, you'll notice that there's a lot of readings listed for this week as like supplemental background readings. We're going to go over the Hamza Walker, the Susan Buckmores, and the Robert Pippin pieces in class today, and that will set us up for the con next week. So, but we will, these things are there more as resources. We'll refer perhaps back to them at certain points, and maybe a little bit today, but again, those are just kind of there as resources. And next week, the Critique of Judgment by Kant, pages 1 through 100, as promised. Now, what that will do is it will take us from, it will be his preface and his introduction, and then it will take us up through the category of the beautiful. So we'll be doing, basically the 3 weeks of Kant correspond to 3 ideas in his book: the beautiful, the sublime, and teleological beings. And we'll see how they build up to that point. Right, so we'll have beautiful objects, sublime forces, and teleological beings as a combination of beautiful objects and sublime forces. Not that that makes any sense whatsoever, but anyway, there are some thematic parsing with the first 3 weeks of Kant. So to wit, he'll be reviewing his philosophy up to that point. We're reading the 3rd critique. So he'll be reviewing the first 2 critiques in the preface and introduction, and he'll be explaining the purpose of the 3rd critique, purpose of the critique of judgment. And we're going to get into it today, what critique means and all that good stuff, and we'll come back to it next week as well. I say all this just to say, are there any brave souls, any intrepid individuals who would like to volunteer to be presenters next week for our first tranche of readings? Okay. All right, there you go. Boom. Excellent. All right, so you guys maybe also coordinate how you like to address. Excellent, thank you. And I posted the discussion thread on Canvas already. It's there. All right. Okay, so let's look at the reading for today. So we're going to start with, we're going to look at 2 things that were published around the time that this course was first taught. So around the time that I first started teaching here at SAIC, and from Chicago people, and also University of Chicago people. The 3rd reading, Susan Buck Morse, was published in 1996, and she's not here in Chicago. We'll see she's at Cornell. And anyway, but we'll have these 3 people introducing for us the themes that we'll be addressing in the course. So we'll start with Hamza Walker, who used to teach here at SAIC for many years. And but now is in LA, and he's at the Getty Museum. All right, so this is just something that I happened to come across because it's from the alumni magazine from the University of Chicago. And so it's just a sort of little journalistic little profile. All right, let's see what this says. Hamza Walker's worst nightmare, Hamza Walker's worst nightmare, he says, is realizing that you are still in Cobb Hall, where you took all your undergraduate classes, and I live it every day. Cobb Hall, when I taught at the University of Chicago, that is where a lot of the undergrad courses are taught. So the Renaissance, we'll see, is a gallery on the top floor of this building. Walker, whom the New York Times has labeled one of the 7 most influential curators in the country, is Director of Education and Associate Curator for the Renaissance Society, the non-collecting museum of contemporary art on Cobb Hall's 4th floor. Nightmare? Walker's broad smile betrays his enthusiasm for his home turf. Founded in 1915 at the university, the Independent Renaissance Society has helped introduce the city to the works of such artists as Pablo Picasso, Pierre Mondrian, Ferdinand Léger, Bruce Nauman, and Cindy Sherman, and established itself as a champion of vanguard art, otherwise known as avant-garde art. Recent exhibitions have included Latter-day Stars, Felix Gonzalez Torres, Helmut Jahn, Carol Walker, and Michael Outer. This summer, Walker stood in the middle of the Renaissance's 3,500 square foot single room exhibition space beneath Cobb's north roof, taking a look at the final cleanup from the latest show, Rebecca Morris's abstract paintings. He'd already envisioned the layout for 5 gigantic video screens needed for the next installation, a collaborative work by Berlin-based artist Peter Weltz and choreographer William Forsythe, tentatively titled All the Pretty Corpses, opening in November. Logistical matters, where to place the screens, how high to turn up the volume, when to dim the lights, account for a significant part of his work, Walker explains. I have a very non-romantic view of whatever curatorial labor has become. In working with artists, it is not simply about the level of content, it also involves discussions about the technical requirements for a given piece. Born in New York City, the son of a jazz musician and a mother who worked several odd jobs, Walker later moved with his family to Baltimore, where he grew up as a young punk full of rage. What could be more alienating than that? He asks. The time, the 70s. The place? So, do you guys know your John Waters movies? Yeah? John Waters movies, all based in Baltimore. So that gives you a little flavor of it. And the 70s. Yeah, the 70s were rough. Walker's about my age, so we were kids in the 70s. Today, his favorite artists work to alienate the viewer. Word again, we'll actually be talking about this. Alienation, he says, turns me on. People who tell him that they just love contemporary art make him suspicious. Quote, I distrust them immediately, he says. I don't inherently like art. That's not a given for me. At Chicago, majoring in art history, he visited the Renaissance regularly. Quote, but all the while I held contemporary work in disdain, he says. So clearly there was some Freudian dynamic at work. So what does that refer to? Ambivalence. Ambivalence not meaning wishy-washy or neutral, lukewarm. Ambivalence meaning opposite feelings at the same time. Love-hate relationship. Love-hate relationship with art. Coming to terms with his contempt informed Walker's appreciation of contemporary art. The work is not the source of my disdain, or my dissatisfaction, or my frustration. The work can only prompt it. He actually welcomes contemporary art's illegibility and hermeticism, and the frustration it can cause a viewer. I do have a passion for it, he says, but it's driven in equal parts by love and disdain. He never imagined becoming a curator. I fell into this, he says. He didn't anticipate making a career of his studies, but he discovered that, quote, after college, any kind of sustained intellectual nourishment about contemporary work is very hard to find, unless you are with other artists. So he focused on becoming a member of the artistic community, working as a public art coordinator at Chicago's Department for Cultural Affairs, and volunteering at the former Randolph Street Gallery before he joined the Renaissance Society in 1994. So he'd been there for 10 years when they were writing this profile. Today, Walker, a tireless traveler and networker, has become known beyond Chicago's art scene not only for his innovative curatorial work, but also for his wide-ranging thinking and writing about contemporary art, published in industry magazines and exhibition catalogs. The New York Times called him, quote, one of the museum world's most talented essayists, and lauded his storytelling approach to shows. Walker is skeptical of the flattery, stressing that he can't stand narrative art. I agree. He wants his shows to function critically, he says, commenting on how we live now. This year he received the Menil Collection's Walter Hopps Award for Curatorial Achievement, given to a curator in early to mid-career. But while he denies being the art world's dramatic figure and rising star, as local and national newspapers have described him over the past few years, he admits that now he can't imagine doing anything else. Quote, if you take a domesticated animal out in the wild, it cannot survive. That's what I feel like. This other world, where people have 9-to-5 jobs, that's the wild. All right, so let's keep in mind a few key points. Alienation, modern contemporary arts, character of alienation. Art should function critically, commenting on how we live now. We'll see what that might mean. All right, you'll see that these readings build on each other. So what Susan Buck-Morss has to say. All right, Susan Buck-Morss is a Frankfurt School scholar. She's one of the first people to write on the Frankfurt School in the United States. So she published a book called Origin of Negative Dialectics about Benjamin and Adorno, And then Dialectics of Seeing about Benjamin. What else can I say about her? Well, this piece is from the October Art Journal, which is the journal that really established postmodernist art criticism in the United States starting in the late 70s. They had put out a visual culture questionnaire, and a bunch of different people had responded. This is her response, which I found to be the most interesting of all the responses.
Sorry, did you say late 70s?
The October Art Journal started then. This is from the 90s.
90s.
Yeah, this is 96. We might say that what the Hamza Walker, Susan Buck Morse, and the Robert Pippin have in common is a kind of postmodernist moment, which is what I thought we were in when I started teaching. I was like, thank God. In 1996, I was here at SAIC. That's when I was finishing my MFA, and we were in the deep throes of postmodernism, and I could not deal. So I was like happy that the storm had passed. Maybe it didn't, after all. But anyway, that was the illusion. The illusion was, oh, we're getting past postmodernism. That would be great. And we'll see what Buck Morse has to say about this. So she's writing a little bit critically into this journal. Like, she's kind of critical of their whole framework, as we'll see. And visual culture and like visual critical studies, VCS, where I teach also here, these are like postmodernist artifacts, you might say. So she writes, the production of a discourse of visual culture entails the liquidation of art, as we have noted. All right, so art and culture, not the same thing. Culture liquidates art. Art distinguishes itself from culture. If you subsume art under culture, you liquidate art. Very important. One of the main moves that postmodernism did was try to liquidate art in the name of culture. There is no way within such a discourse for art to sustain a separate existence, not as a practice, not as a phenomenon, not as an experience, not as a discipline. Museums would then need to become double encasings, preserving art objects and preserving the art idea. Art history departments would be moved in with archaeology. And what of artists? In the recently expired socialist societies, so it's the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, artists printed up calling cards with their profession listed confidently after their name and phone number. Chris Cutrone, artist, call me. I guess email me. Go to my website. In recently restructured capitalist societies, artists became caught in a dialectical cul-de-sac, a contradictory dead end. Attempting to rescue the autonomy of art as a reflective, critical practice by attacking the museum, the very institution that maintains the illusion that art exists. Artists, as a social class, demand sponsors, the state, private patrons, corporations. Their products enter the market through a dealer-critic system that manipulates value and is mediated by galleries, museums, and private collections. Tomorrow's artists may opt to go underground, much like Freemasons of the 18th century. They may choose to do their work esoterically while employed as producers of visual culture. And maybe artists have gone underground. Even if they're still above ground, maybe the art part of what they do has gone underground. Artists' work, here's a great thesis statement for the whole course. Ready? Artists' work is to sustain the critical moment of aesthetic experience. Artists' work is to sustain the critical moment of aesthetic experience. Our work as critics is to recognize it. Kind of reciprocal relationship, complementary relationship between, we might say, practice and theory, or art and criticism. Can this be done best, or done at all, within a new interdisciplinary field of visual studies? What would be the episteme, or theoretical frame of such a field? Twice at Cornell over the past decade, we have had meetings to discuss the creation of a visual studies program. Both times it was painfully clear that institutionalization cannot by itself produce such a frame. And the discussions among a disparate group of art historians, anthropologists, computer designers, social historians, and scholars of cinema, literature, and architecture did not coalesce into a program. Still, visual culture has become a presence on campus. It has worked its way into many of the traditional disciplines and lives there in suspended isolation, encapsulated within theoretical bubbles. The psychoanalytic bubble is the biggest, but there are others. One could list a common set of readings, a canon of texts by Roland Barthes, Walter Benjamin, Michel Foucault, Jacques Lacan, as well as a pre-canon of texts by a long list of contemporary writers. Certain themes are standard: the reproduction of the image, the society of the spectacle, that's Guy Debord, envisioning the other, scopic regimes, the simulacrum, Baudrillard, the fetish, the male gaze, the machine eye. Today the phrase visual studies, and this is where it gets dated, calls out 202 entries in a keyword search at the Cornell University libraries. That's when they had CD-ROM databases, kind of early or pre-internet. So now, of course, you do visual studies, you get 5 million things on Google. There is a media library, a cinema program, an art museum, a theater art center, 2 slide libraries, what the hell are slides, and a half dozen possessively guarded department-owned video cassette players. If the theoretical bubbles burst, there remains this infrastructure of technological reproduction. It's a Benjamin phrase, Walter Benjamin. Visual culture, once a foreigner to the academy, has gotten its green card and is here to stay. That resonates in a funny way. Silent movies at the beginning of the century, namely beginning of the 20th century, so like 125 years ago, initiated the utopian idea of a universal language of images, one that could glide over political and ethnic borders and set to right the Tower of Babel. Action films and MTV at the end of the century have realized this idea in secularized, instrumentalized form, producing subjects for the next stage of global capitalism. In this way, visual culture becomes the concern of the social sciences. Quote, images in the mind motivate the will, wrote Walter Benjamin, alluding to the political power of images claimed by surrealism. But his words could provide the motto as well for the advertising industry, product sponsoring and political campaigning. Whereas today, the freedom of expression of artists is defended on formal grounds that stress the virtuality of the representation. The images of art, it is argued, have no effect in the realm of deeds. There was a lot of that going on in the 80s and 90s. There was a lot of like cutting of arts funding based on controversial art. Robert Mapplethorpe, Andre Serrano, these are like the poster child for the Republican Party to say government art funding should be cut. And it was defended as, well, this doesn't, Robert Mapplethorpe's photography doesn't make people become BDSM practitioners. Who knows? She writes, a critical analysis of the image as a social object is needed more urgently than a program that legitimates its culture. This is really important. Critical analysis of the image as a social object is needed more urgently than a program that legitimates its culture. Right? So the role of the critic is not to legitimate the culture of the artwork or the artist. Isn't that what it's all become now? Isn't that all that it is now? She writes, we need to be able to read images emblematically and symptomatically in terms of the most fundamental questions of social life. Now, what are the most fundamental questions of social life? We'll see. She's already given a hint, maybe capitalism? This means that critical theories are needed, theories that are themselves visual, that show rather than argue. Such conceptual constellations convince by their power to illuminate the world, bringing to consciousness what was before only dimly perceived, so that it becomes available for critical reflection. It's another good thesis statement. So if artists' work is to sustain the critical moment of aesthetic experience, how does that actually work? It, like criticism, art might bring to consciousness what was only dimly perceived before, so that it becomes available for critical reflection, right? To sort of manifest something that we might already know but not have a way of grasping, whether conceptually or aesthetically. She writes, I do not understand the description of anthropological models and socio-historical models as antithetical poles of this theoretical project. Any interpretation worth its salt demands both. It needs to provide a socio-historical and biographical story of origins that estranges the object from us and shows us that its truth is not immediately accessible, the object's prehistory, and provide a story of deferred action, its after history, that comes to terms with the potency of the object within our own horizon of concerns. Now there's a lot packed into that. This is something that we'll get into later in the course. It's not going to be something up front with Kant, but we'll start to get into it, actually starting with Schiller. Namely, how art is and is not, at the same time, tied to its historical moment. So it's Schiller is going to put it this way, that the contemporary artist has to be completely committed to their own time without succumbing to it. Completely committed to their own time without succumbing to it. It means having a critical relationship to the present moment, which history can help provide, actually. So prehistory, after history, the life of the artwork as part of a historical moment. So we'll see in a minute. She'll get more into this, and Robert Bittman will follow up on that. So the truth of a work is not immediately accessible, and theory should maybe estrange the object from us, put it at a critical distance. She writes, while the internet is the topic and the medium for new courses in digital culture, it is striking to anyone who has visited the internet how visually impoverished a homepage can be. Cyber digits reproduce the moving image haltingly and the static image unimpressively. The possibility of computer screens replacing television screens, that has happened, may mean a great deal to stockholders of telephone companies, but it will not shake the world of the visual image. Aesthetic experience, sensory experience, is not reducible to information. Is it old-fashioned to say so? Perhaps the era of images that are more than information is already behind us. Actually, this is something that Kant's going to start addressing immediately. Right, so the fact that art is more than logical propositions, it's more than information, it's more than empirical data, it's actually more than sense data perception. Right, all the things that can be reproduced digitally, but perhaps not aesthetically that way. We'll see what that might all mean. Perhaps discussions about visual culture as a field have come too late. It is with nostalgia that we boycott the video store and insist upon seeing movies on the big screen. The producers of the visual culture of tomorrow are the camera women, video film editors, city planners, set designers for rock stars, tourism packagers, marketing consultants, political consultants, television producers, commodity designers, layout persons, and cosmetic surgeons. They are the students who sit in our classes today. What is it they need to know? What will be gained and by whom in offering them a program in visual studies? Okay, so that's a little dig that she's getting in at the end, meaning, what are we educating people here at the Art Institute in? Are we educating them to just become cultural producers for the next stage of global capitalism? Or are we trying to educate the children more critically about art? Is art just another cultural commodity, or does it have a more critical function, purpose? All right, so now we'll get into what's meant by critical. For that, we'll turn to the longer reading for today. Since Robert Pippin. Okay, so this is another response to another questionnaire, this time by another journal, not the October Art History Journal or Art Criticism Journal, but Critical Inquiry, which is a journal published out of the University of Chicago and that promoted a great deal of critical theory. So they were asking in 2003 the board members of the journal and other intellectuals, prominent intellectuals and cultural commentators, what's the current state and future of critical theory? So that's what he's responding to. He writes, and Robert Pippin is, he's a German idealism, philosophy professor, scholar. He's a Hegel scholar, University of Chicago, who studied with, as a young faculty member with Herbert Marcuse, who will also make a cameo in this class later, who was one of the Frankfurt School people who stayed in the United States after World War II. So he was a little bit of a celebrity in the 1960s New Left. He was teaching at that time at the University of California, San Diego. And he got targeted by the Vice President of the United States, Richard Nixon's Vice President, Spiro Agnew, and also by Ronald Reagan, who was governor of California at the time. And what's very similar to things going on now with like Trump and Ron DeSantis and J.D. Vance and these people, right? The culture wars. Right. Anyway, so Pippin, he was a new leftist. I studied with him. So he was a new leftist. He was a member of the Students for a Democratic Society. Him and his friends in the SDS chapter at their college all went on to be Hegel scholars afterwards. And then, so they were motivated out of their kind of leftist political commitments to do a deep dive and dedicate themselves to German idealist philosophy of all things. So let's see why that might have been the case. He writes, other board members, I expect, will comment on the state of matters critical in literature and the arts. There is also, of course, the issue of the status of a critical theory of society. So I wanted to say something about the state and future of critical theory as such on C. Essentially the left Hegelian, Marxist, Frankfurt School tradition. Although the notion has become broad enough so that even the likes of Heidegger and his influential legacy and army of epigones are relevant. Okay, so what is that? That's a little dig. So Heidegger, of course, was a reactionary philosopher. He just was. He became a fan and eager participant in the Nazi regime in Germany. And he thought of his philosophy as being entirely geared against Marxism. So the irony being, the anti-Marxist gets included with the Marxists in this category of critical theory. So who are the influential army of epigones? They are what I like to call the French fries. So Derrida, Foucault, Deleuze, Lacan, Althusser, all the Heideggerian postmodernists, the French fries, not freedom fries, the French fries. Gia?
I was just gonna ask if Italian's also in there.
Who?
Italian?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess he's Italian, but the Italians are just under the French anyway. I know. Europe is well, you guys know Europe is a Franco-German condominium to which the rest are subject.
Because it can be sometimes a little bit hard to just split the residue topic.
No, and the Anglos have gotten into the French, big time French theory. So French theory is like way more influential than it ought to have been, but nonetheless, here we are. So that's who he means, anyway. Yeah.
Are Sartre, Camus, the existentialists also?
A little bit, but they're not theorists, right? Exactly. Like Sartre was more like a philosopher, and Camus is just a kind of a writer, you know. So it's a little bit different. Existentialism, though, is something that we'll talk about. So Heidegger, he is in some ways the initiator of existentialism in the 20th century, and but existentialism has a kind of a broad background with Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. So Heidegger comes more via the Nietzsche, and Kierkegaard's influence is felt more broadly. Now, Sartre was Heidegger's student. So in fact, he should also be considered a French fry, but he's a little bit to one side of the little pack of French fries from McDonald's. So, yeah.
Sorry, what year was this again?
2003, 2004 that he's writing this.
Okay.
Yeah.
So would you say that like the sort of Agamben branch is being included in?
Oh, Agamben for sure. Agamben for sure. Yeah, Agamben is for sure. Talk about Italians. Yeah, he's definitely in there because he's what would you call him? He is a Heideggerian. He's also in dialogue with the Frankfurt School. So there is the other thing about the Frankfurt School that Pippin is commenting on here is that its English language reception happened mostly after their time, so in the 70s and 80s. And then because of postmodernism's rise in that period, Frankfurt School tended to be interpreted in postmodernist terms. So the Frankfurt School was seen as like proto-postmodernist. We'll see. We'll see. And also, the Frankfurt School is often called Heideggerian. For instance, Marcuse was a student of Heidegger in the pre-Nazi time. And certainly Adorno has a whole critique of Heidegger that's very central to his work, which then intellectual historians are like, oh, the reason he's arguing so much with Heidegger is that he actually agrees with Heidegger, or something like that. There is a kind of, this is the category of continental philosophy. Continental philosophy is everything, not analytic philosophy. So it's Kant and Hegel and Heidegger, it's everything, right? It's a kind of indiscriminate category, which is unfortunate. So, yes, the influential legacy and army of Epigenes are also relevant for better or for worse. He says, this will be just an attempt to identify the unsolved problem. So he thinks that there's one unsolved problem, the unsolved problem. It will have to be breathless, and I'm not entirely sure it is relevant, but here goes. The historical dimension first. He writes, I understand critical theory to be at its core a post-Kantian phenomenon. That is very much a legacy of the original Kantian idea of critical philosophy. A critique by reason of itself. The basic claim is that first philosophy, prima philosophia, the foundation of all pre-modern university learning and all science, was not in fact any longer regarded as first. A critical account of the possibility of such, or any other claim to know, was first necessary. This is all immediately subject to Hegel's famous objection that it is like trying to learn to swim before one enters the water. Put that to one side. What then does it mean to see Kant, or the Kantian moment, as the hinge on which something quite new in the history of philosophy and social and perhaps aesthetic theory swings open? The most important result of the all-destroying Kant, that's what he was known by his critics at the time, was the destruction of metaphysics, as traditionally understood. That is, the a priori knowledge of substance. Philosophy, which we'll see he's defining right here now as non-empirical claims to know. In other words, can we know something without an empirical experience of it? How is that possible? philosophy, could not be understood as about the world or things in themselves, but rather had to be reconceived as concerned with our mode of knowledge of objects. In other words, philosophy is really about the subject rather than about the world or things in themselves. Eventually, this would become the linguistic turn, logicism, sociology of knowledge, all sorts of things. But the most important result for later critical theory concerned the status of necessity in philosophy. In other words, why is philosophy necessary? Or Kant's attempt to argue that some philosophical account of the once and for all necessary conditions of knowledge was possible. To make a very long story very short, after Kant, while the critical attack on the very possibility of first philosophy survived, this faith in a formal philosophy, capable of delivering an epistemological form of necessary truth, did not. Retaining the notion of a subjective contribution to, legislation of, the possibility of representational content, or all aspects of human experience fraught with odds, and I'll explain that in a minute, but without the necessity or fixity, meant that it wasn't long before the most important aspect of the Kantian aftermath was apparent. Hegel's famous claim in the preface to the Philosophy of Right that philosophy is its own time comprehended in thoughts, or that every philosopher is essentially a child of his time. This all meant that some new way of conceiving of philosophy adequate to the realization of the radically historical nature of the human condition was now necessary, especially one that could distinguish in some way what was central, elemental, essential, in some way that on which other quite variable and much more contingent aspects of human historical time depended. The problem of understanding properly, especially critically, conceptual, artistic, and social change was henceforth at the forefront of much European philosophy. I'm going to jump ahead here. For it was also the time, as this consensus was building about historicity, post-metaphysical philosophy, and so forth, that some consensus was also building in European high culture that the modern form of life, coming into view after the middle of the 19th century, so mid-1800s or so, was in some way, some basic way, unacceptable, unaffirmable, pathological even, certainly ugly. To cut to the chase, it then became obvious how difficult it would be to theorize, as it is now put, this gap or absence or lack in this new comprehensive form of life. So what is the new comprehensive form of life in the middle of the 1800s? Capitalism. This is after the Industrial Revolution. So we'll see from a Marxist standpoint, that's capitalism. No appeal to an underlying unrealized human nature was possible. No appeal to an independent moral criterion was possible. And the idea of an underlying historical teleology, such that what was missing was what was not yet actual, but being realized, began to seem a metaphysical regression. This meant that the problem of critical theory turned out to be connected to a very old problem, indeed the oldest, long ago called the problem of non-being, or how to say what is not without saying nothing. In this case, it is the problem of theorizing what was historically missing, absent, simply not in this historical moment, and understanding the nature of its claim on our attention, or how to understand, theorize the recoil or aversion to modernity already apparent in Holderlin's Nostalgia, so that's his romantic poet who is Hegel's roommate, in fact, and other romantic productions, and much more in evidence in Kierkegaard's The Present Age, Nietzsche's Death of God, and so forth. Formulating an adequate account of what was missing, unrealized, or just unacceptable in these altered conditions proved difficult and provoked ever more radical solutions. He writes, I think this problem remains poorly understood and hardly yet well worked out. Not resolved by Walter Benjamin's idiosyncratic Messianism and philosophy of history, nor in Adorno's negative dialectics and attempted recovery of the non-identical, although Adorno comes as close as anyone to realizing the generality and difficulty of the post-idealist dimension of the problem. and not in the most radical response to the problem, Heidegger's. What is sought is some sense of the falseness, not merely of contemporary philosophical positions, but of everyday life itself. The falseness, deceptiveness, thoughtlessness, and forgetfulness of the ordinary itself. And all this without a reinstallation of traditional reality appearance distinctions. Heidegger came up with a novel, explosive account of the inherent nothingness of the everyday world, its potential for an episodic, largely inexplicable breakdown in anxiety and homelessness, and then proposed a vast novel ontological account as a way of thinking through the implications of this distinct fragility and groundlessness. So much for a short history of non-being. He writes, I only mean that I think critical theory still needs an account of what isn't in what is, and still needs to understand the dimensions of this problem as an interconnected problem from Kant on appearance, Hegel on dialectic and teleology, Marx on contradiction, Kierkegaard on despair, Nietzsche on the nihil in nihilism, Adorno on negative dialectics, and Heidegger on nichts, which means nothingness. So we'll be dealing with Kant on appearance. We'll be dealing to some extent with Hegel on dialectic and teleology. We won't be dealing very much with Marx. We'll be dealing with Marx indirectly, nor Kierkegaard. We will be addressing Nietzsche on the nihil and nihilism. We won't be doing Adorno on negative dialectics, but we'll see how it comes to bear in his aesthetic theory, and we won't be doing Heidegger. He says, in fact, I would say that the level of discussion and awareness of this issue in its historical dimensions, with respect both to the history of critical theory and the history of modernization, has regressed. And he goes through and says he thinks Habermas didn't do it, Foucault didn't do it, deconstruction didn't do it, post-colonial theory didn't do it. And he says, now it is possible to say that the problem with contemporary critical theory is that it has become insufficiently critical. And he writes, I should say that I still believe that the Hegelian response to this situation, post-metaphysical philosophy, radical historicity, modernist dissatisfaction, that's a good catchphrase to keep in mind, modernist dissatisfaction, is the most promising. It is tagged by such phrases as the causality of fate, internal critique, we'll be dealing with that as immanent critique, and determinate negation, and usually involves a three-stage claim. The lack or gap or failure in question is initially the obvious one. A community is not living up to its own ideals, or cannot, as in tragic situations. This is then said to have unavoidable experiential consequences, a kind of suffering due to its own unreason. And this feature, of course, is why attention to contemporary literature and art can become so theoretically important, as a way of evincing and beginning to diagnose such suffering. And then the most difficult claim. The status of the ideal not being lived up to is something like the best we've been able to do so far. And so it is not just a fact about a local community at such a stage that it cannot live up to its own ideal. That failure has significance beyond its local meaning, all of which forces on stage the difficult issue of the referent of the community, so described, and the now tired issue of grand narratives. Okay, so grand narratives. So postmodernism is very anti-grand narratives, but we're going to be treading into the domain of grand narratives for sure, and in some ways Marxism was the grandest of all grand narratives, in fact. And that's what postmodernism was really taking aim at, starting with Heidegger. Regardless of how all that might be worked out, there is also a historical cost for the neglect or under-attention or lack of resolution of this core critical problem. The still unresolved problem, he called it. Repetition. Essentially, the cost is the rather mysterious repetition, now over several generations, of a number of the original moments of recoil, revulsion, and alienation among the founding formulations in modernism. How long can art be about the end of art? Why did modernist art turn to itself as its subject? How many iterations of what is essentially 19th century French bourgeois self-hatred are possible in the novel before we exhaust that moment? It may seem extreme to claim well, to claim at all that such repetition exists, that postmodernism, say, is an instance of such repetition. And also to claim that it is tied somehow to the dim understanding we have of the post-Kantian situation with respect to, let's say, the necessary conditions for the possibility of what isn't. But however sketchy, that is what I wanted to suggest. I'm not sure it will get us anywhere. Philosophy rarely does. Perhaps philosophy exists to remind us that we haven't gotten anywhere. And that's a little echo of an Adornoism. Adorno began his book Negative Dialectics, saying that philosophy lives on because the moment for its realization was missed. Meaning, the fact that we still do things philosophically is a symptom. It's a symptom of continued capitalism. It's a symptom of alienation. So there's a kind of a parallel here between art and philosophy that we will be addressing in the course. But they're both symptomatic of something. Symptomatic of capitalism, symptomatic of alienation. All right, so he used the phrase fraught with oughts. So I wanted to, first of all, illustrate this issue of modernism and then address this question of the ought, the ought. So here's a romantic but modernist poem by Rilke that sort of captures the question of modernity, something that we'll also start to address today, the question of the critical character of modernism and what modernism is. But let's look at this real quick. So the archaic torso of Apollo, this will actually anticipate some things that we'll discuss later with Nietzsche, with the birth of tragedy, namely the Apollonian and the Dionysian. So who was Apollo? Apollo is the god of form. He's the form-giving god. He rides his chariot across the sky, that's the sun, and he casts out rays of light that give form to the world. He's the god of form, but his representation is only available as a broken form, as a fragmented form, as a torso. So there are many such things that have been recovered. So the head's knocked off, the arms, legs are knocked off, the genitals are knocked off, usually because of Christian iconoclasts. Right? Not just from normal wear and tear. We cannot know his legendary head, with eyes like ripening fruit. And yet his torso is still suffused with brilliance from inside, like a lamp, in which his gaze, now turned to low, gleams in all its power. Otherwise the curved breast could not dazzle you so, nor could a smile run through the placid hips and thighs to that dark center where procreation flared. Otherwise the stone would seem defaced beneath the translucent cascade of the shoulders, and would not glisten like a wild beast's fur, would not, from the borders of itself, burst like a star. For here there is no place that does not see you. You must change your life. Okay, so what's going on here? So on the one hand, Romanticism, the idea of a broken tradition, of a lost canon, of a disconnection from cultural history and from a kind of holistic aesthetic experience that the ancients seem to have. Right, so there's a kind of romantic nostalgia for what seems to have been lost in modernity. And so they turn to classical antiquity, they turn back to ancient Greece and Rome, they turn to the Middle Ages, they turn to like pre-modern Christianity, pre-Protestant Christianity. And they looked there for something that was whole, that is now broken and fragmented. Right? So where the modernist twist comes in is to emphasize, well, in fact, what do we take with this? What do we do with this? How do we take this broken tradition? We reconstruct it. We reconstruct it in our imagination, and it becomes more than perhaps it was. Perhaps it becomes more than this broken fragment, and becomes perhaps more than it originally was at the same time. So we transform it. We inherit this tradition as a broken tradition, or we transform it with our imagination. It's going to be a central category of Kant's critique of judgment. And the work of our imagination tells us something else. It tells us something not just about the world that we're imagining and working on through our imagination, but it tells us about ourselves. Namely, it gives us an inkling of our freedom. Freedom to change. You must change your life. Right? So we're implicated by the object. The subject's implicated by the object. It sees you. You don't only see it, it sees you. How does it see you? It sees you as this agent of change, including changing oneself. Okay, and that gets us into the domain of the fraught with thoughts. So let's look at that. All right, so we're going to see immediately upon reading Kant next time, what is the actual subject of philosophy? What is philosophy really concerned with? Freedom. Freedom. That's what makes it critical philosophy. That's what makes it modern philosophy. That's what makes it a philosophy of change. And so why did this critical philosophy come about when it did in the late 1700s? Because in European philosophy in particular, because European civilization had undergone several centuries of very radical, dramatic change. Gone through hundreds of years of religious wars, revolutions, societal transformation. And the question was, how would you make sense of this change? Is this something that's happened to us? Or is it something that we've participated in? It seems clearly something that we've done ourselves. We've made this change ourselves. And so the task of philosophy is to figure out how and why we made these changes that we made. The modern world. So, freedom. But freedom is this very peculiar word that's bandied about, and we have an ancient definition of freedom, and that's from Aristotle. The ancient definition of freedom from Aristotle is the freedom to be. So something is free when it's free to realize its nature, when it's free to be what it is supposed to be. So if a plant can grow freely from a seed, unimpeded, then it is free. If a people can practice its religion and culture unhampered by anyone else, unhindered by anyone else, then they are free. Freedom to be. Freedom to be what you are. Right, so Moses, let my people go. Let my people be. Right, let us out of bondage where we can't practice our religion. Right, that's ancient freedom. Ancient freedom, freedom to be. Moderns have a different notion of freedom that comes from a different experience of freedom and therefore a different task of freedom. And that's the freedom not simply to be, but to become, to change, to transform. So it's freedom as transformation. And transformation is something that's very difficult to conceptualize because it involves two contradictory things. For transformation to happen, there has to be something that transforms, and yet something has to change about it. So transformation is both continuity and change. And because of that, any transformation is going to appear paradoxical or self-contradictory. It's going to seem to be two contradictory things, continuity and change. So change, something is changed, but yet it continues to be. Transformation. How does a stated being undergo a process of becoming such that something new and different comes out of the given and the same? One way of talking about this is going to be Hegel and Schiller will introduce this language. It's there in Kant, but less directly. Nature and spirit. Nature and spirit. So nature in a meaning, in a connotation that's different from our English language colloquial meaning of nature. So when we say nature, we mean like physical and biological nature. In this philosophical sense, and that's why it's capital N nature, nature, and also in a German language sense, nature is literally everything you're born into. And so that includes not only physical and biological existence, but also culture, society, and history. So it includes everything that has become the case historically. So history is included in nature, culture is included in nature, society is included in nature. Since after all, we are part of nature. We are still part of nature. Everything is nature. Spirit, the movement of becoming in nature. How does nature move? How does it change? How is it transformed? With what spirit does that happen? And spirit, the term in German is Geist, and it can be translated in English as either spirit or as mind. Mind. So that means there's something about consciousness that's related to spirit. Spiritual activity, geistig activity, is anything that we do, any of our activity, that through which we become conscious of our freedom. So art is a geistig activity. Politics is a geistig activity, believe it or not. It's a spiritual activity in the way this term spirit is used. It's a place where we become conscious of our freedom, or are supposed to anyway. Right, so art and politics are geistig activities. Now, one way of describing it, which is going to be Kant's way of describing it, that Pippin used, is what's the relationship between what is and what ought to be? What's the relation between the extant, what exists, and, in a strange use of the word, its actuality? So the idea is the actuality of something is not merely as it is, but as it might change. What is its potential for transformation? Right, so the actuality of something is not simply as it exists, but as it might become, as it might change, and become different from what it was. Now, becoming is a tricky idea because it suggests that there is something that you're trying to become. So it's hard to distinguish that from being. It's kind of like the acorn becomes a tree, right? And so it's kind of like, well, isn't that the being of the acorn to become the tree? So in fact, it helps to illustrate it further. And for that, we have Nietzsche to thank, namely his word, self-overcoming. Self-overcoming, or Selbstaufhebung, self-overcoming. So the tree is not merely the becoming of the acorn, but is in some way the self-overcoming of the acorn. So self-overcoming, Selbstaufhebung. Aufhebung is a weird word. It can be translated and usually is a sublation, which means nothing in English whatsoever. It's kind of a made-up Latin word. But in German, Aufhebung is an ordinary word. It's a regular speech word, and it means to take up something. So Selbstaufhebung means to take yourself up. To take yourself up in this way of overcoming oneself. And self-overcoming means two contradictory things at once. It means fulfilling yourself, or fulfilling oneself, negating oneself. So fulfilling oneself, which also means negating oneself. So you fulfill yourself by negating yourself. You negate yourself by fulfilling yourself. Completing yourself, but also transcending yourself. Realizing yourself, but also abolishing yourself. And in fact, Selbstaufhebung, although self-overcoming, though Nietzsche definitely deals with it as a personal, like individual thing. Every form of life is characterized, we will see, by a self-overcoming. But in fact, the category is meant to speak more broadly. It's not supposed to be so individual and personal. So, for instance, Marxism was mentioned. How did Marxism understand capitalism and communism, or capitalism and socialism? Socialism was meant to be the self-overcoming of capitalism. It was supposed to be the fulfillment, but also the negation of capitalism. In fact, socialism and communism were not possible before capitalism. And yet capitalism, its truth, is not merely as it is, but as it might become. So when Pippin says, what isn't and what is, that's communism and capitalism. That's like a euphemism for what are we suffering from in this society? Why are we contradicting the ideals that we have? Because we're in the midst of a process of self-transformation, a task of self-overcoming, task of freedom, in which something that doesn't exist, we suffer from that as an unrealized potential in what does exist. So the ought, what ought to be, what could be, what's potential and possible, but also what should be. So there's a kind of a moral imperative to it as well. In other words, we're not true to ourselves unless we're trying to overcome ourselves. Actualize ourselves, which means change ourselves. So for instance, Hegel, he's going to mention this in the introductory lectures on aesthetics that we will read, but elsewhere in his introductory lecture on the philosophy of history, he says freedom is not a property, it's not something that you can own, it's not a possession. Like one is not free, rather one is constantly struggling to become free. So freedom is a process of becoming, not a state of being, and he says from the Prussian absolute monarchy where he's writing, he says, the problem with the English is that they think freedom is their possession. They don't realize they still have to struggle for it. And so in treating it as a possession, they abdicate on it, they fail to do what they're tasked with doing, and so they've become like middle-aged men who have given up on their dreams of youth and are just waiting to die. Because at that time, the English were in the forefront of the revolution. They had made the revolution in the 1600s. The Americans continued it, the French tried to continue it, and then had the problems that they had, the drama of the French Revolution. And the Germans didn't really have it. Meaning they were conquered by Napoleon. Hegel celebrated it. Celebrated the conquest of Germany by the French. Got his students together, popped a champagne cork, and said, "Vive la Révolution." Right. But then, of course, Napoleon was defeated and the revolution was overthrown. Freedom. So not a state of being, a process of becoming. Not what one is, but what one ought to be. Right? So fraught with oughts, what does it mean to say that the world that we live in is fraught with oughts? It means we suffer from an unrealized potential. It's a very peculiar way of thinking about things, and yet it used to be a more commonplace understanding of things. Namely, that the pathology of capitalism is the suffering, as Nietzsche is going to put it in our readings, from an illness the way pregnancy is an illness. Meaning the task is to bring forth a new form of life. So it's a suffering, it's an illness, not to be avoided, but to be gone through, to bring forth new life. So, and this is something that the Marxists would say. They would say capitalism is pregnant with communism. That's the idea. The idea is that we're suffering from an unfulfilled potential in modern society starting in the mid-1800s, starting in the mid-19th century, which is when modernism was invented after the Industrial Revolution. So I want to say something about that. So modernism, modernity. So there's a couple of characters who are central to our story in the course who are in fact nonetheless absent on the syllabus. Marx is one. The other is Baudelaire, who was a poet and a critic, but who was going to be influential. He was influential for Nietzsche. He's going to be a touchstone for Adorno. We'll see. And he's the one who coined the term modernity. And so I wanted just to conclude class today, clarify these terms. Because they're usually used interchangeably, but they should not be. So modern, modernity, and modernism. So we tend to use these terms interchangeably, but they actually mean different things. So the word modern is an ancient word, and it just means the present relative to the past. So it just means now as opposed to then. It just means current. Modern means current, as opposed to ancient, which means prior. Modernity, however, Baudelaire's word, is what is new and different, new and different, and specific and unique about right now. So he coined this idea in 1846. So what is it about the mid-1800s, this present now, that is new and different, unique and specific, unlike any other time in the past? That's what he called modernity. And it means capitalism. That's what it means. So it means the capitalist world, which was pathological and ugly. Except Baudelaire said, well, maybe it has its own beauty. That doesn't correspond to ancient beauty. Maybe what, from a standpoint of the past, from the standard of the past, would seem ugly, but maybe it's a new form of beauty, in fact. So he doesn't use the term, but he is basically inventing thereby modernism. Modernism. So in his criticism, he said, artists now have to be true to their own time. They can't base their art on the art of the past. They have to try to exemplify the present, what's new and different about the present. So they're tasked by modernity to be true to it through their work. And so it is, so this is, modernity is the new and different condition of the present. And then modernism is the task in response to that condition. So what are we supposed to do? What ought we do in the face of this new condition that we're living in, but also how are we new and different? So he says we have different feelings, we have different sensibilities than people in the past. We have different psychology than people in the past. We respond positively to things that people in the past would have responded negatively to. We respond negatively to things that in the past people responded positively to. And not only in the realm of aesthetics, but in morality as well. So we consider our moral values, what we consider to be good, ancient peoples would have considered evil. And what they considered good, we would consider evil. So that's why he titled his collection of poems, The Flowers of Evil. the flowers of evil, because from any past standpoint, the world that we live in now, and indeed we ourselves, would be considered evil. And like I said, we would look back and think that what they did was evil. So the way that I like to put this is everything that we can imagine as a moral atrocity today, everything, like the worst thing we can imagine doing morally, whatever you come up with in your head, has at some point been practiced by some people at some time as morally good. Everything that we consider to be morally reprehensible today was in fact practiced by people at some point, in some time, in some cultural contexts, historically, as morally good. And that's true across cultures, it's true across history, meaning in Western history or European history or whatever you want to call it, that's also the case. What the Greeks and the Romans and the medieval people did that they considered to be morally good, we would consider to be evil. And things that we do, they would consider morally evil. Things that we do that we consider to be good, they would consider to be morally evil. You want one example? Gender equality. We consider it to be good. Pretty much all people ever throughout history, across all cultures, that would be considered evil. Namely, harmful. Harmful.
So isn't incest considered a universal, like a trans-historical taboo, incest?
Yes, but what counts as incest, it differs. What counts as incest differs because it's culturally specific. Meaning, we don't do the incest taboo because of biology, we don't. That's like a myth that we have for ourselves, is that we think people are inbred and whatever. No, that really doesn't matter too much. It only matters if there are specific diseases. So incest is defined differently. So for instance, I think that are we allowed to marry cousins, first cousins? I don't think we are. We're not allowed to. I don't think so. I forget. There are rules. There are like weird rules. But anyway, there was a time when in fact you were obligated to. Right, so that has to do with cultural rules about family, who's in and who's out of the family. And it has nothing to do with biology because adopted children are also not supposed to be like an adopted brother and sister, not genetically related, still not allowed. That's incest, right? So that's a cultural thing. It's called exogamy. If you know anything about anthropology, exogamy. It's the obligation for people to marry outside their family. It's a rule established to keep society together, to keep families from becoming their own little self-enclosed cults that they would otherwise become. So exogamy, incest. I guess incest is like the most morally reprehensible thing we can imagine. I guess so. I was thinking more like, exciting stuff like violence and, I don't know, like torture and, I don't know, whatever. But I guess, yeah, sex is still a big moral taboo place, isn't it? Yeah. Although, like I said, the house down the street where the people hardly ever go out, right?
Sorry.
The house down the street where the people hardly go out and where the father thinks he's the reincarnation of Jesus, usually there's some incest going on there. Right? He's reproducing his tribe over there. Every town has one house down the road, those strange people. And then it turns out, like years later, it's like, oh, where did all those children come from? They never could leave the house.
I don't really understand what you mean by, like, gender equality as an example. Like, yeah, our specific definition of gender equality is, like, very embedded in, like, our current condition.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know what you mean, like, is that nuance what you're considering? Or, like, because a lot of different cultures, even through prehistory, did
They had
consider
funny
this a bit
equality,
different.
meaning they had difference and parity,
Yeah.
but parity and difference, right? But still, Yeah, so it's true that it's modern society that creates a commensurable realm between the genders that raises the question of equality in a way that wasn't the case previously, because the genders had their own spheres, basically. But we can also say those spheres were unequal, meaning women were in the domestic sphere and men were in the public sphere, and certainly from the standpoint of geistic activity, how history moved, how things changed, the political realm, women tended to be excluded from politics.
Are we considering like prehistory or
Hunter-gatherers, we could use that one. So Friedrich Engels, who was the Marx buddy, he wrote a book called The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. And he called even the hunter-gatherers primitive communism, otherwise known as the world historic defeat of women. The gender division of labor he called it the world historic defeat of women, meaning when women didn't hunt but only gathered.
I heard that was not entirely true though.
It's tricky because there is the myth of the Amazons, and then there were communities where the women hunted.
Yeah.
Right, so it's not, but that was his point. His point was that even though hunter-gatherers have a division of labor that seems somewhat hierarchical, and that didn't always exist. In other words, it's about the matriarchy, and also there was a time even before the gender division of labor. That's why he called it the world historic defeat of women. Meaning, primitive communism itself had a history that was differentiated. And that's because he was concerned with women's equality, in fact. That was the whole point. Like socialists, communists, not only Marxists, but everybody, anarchists, all of them, the utopian socialists, they had a forefront concern about women's equality in the 1800s, in fact. And sexual liberation, too. Sexual freedom as well. Part and parcel of that. So, no, it's very tricky. But yeah, so we have a problem, namely the problem of gender equality that maybe other peoples didn't have, and that we have to be careful about projecting that back onto the past, but we can't help but do it. And also, we should remind ourselves that there are political people who are trying to bring back old gender roles now, today. Right? There are fundamentalist religious movements. There's the trad wives. The trad wives, what? Right? And then there's the more benign version, which is Andrew Yang, the UBI, Universal Basic Income, that maybe women should be paid to be stay-at-home mothers by the state, because that's socially useful labor that isn't compensated by the market, right? As some kind of strange egalitarianism, right? So, yes, we have very specific problems we're dealing with now, and we do have to be careful about projecting them onto the past. My point was more basic, which is that we have to denaturalize the present. Meaning we need to understand that the world that we live in now is not at all a natural condition and is very different from the way people lived in the past. With different psychology, different sensibility, different spontaneous emotional responses to things. Children used to be put in front of public torture and execution. Now we would consider that to be child abuse. If you made children watch someone be hung or decapitated or tortured, drawn and quartered, we'd be like, the kid's going to be traumatized for life. But no, the kids played and laughed and had a great time. They weren't traumatized for life whatsoever. But today they would be traumatized for life. And that's because we've changed. We've changed. We have changed. Oh, corporal punishment? Yes.
Yeah.
No, I'm 55 years old, so I was definitely hit as a child. So the idea that no children can be hit now is very strange. It's very strange. I mean, God bless. God bless. But yeah, it is like that. Spare the rod, spoil the child. Children. Who knows what the outcome of this experiment will be? The experiment of the social workers? Right? The state coming between parents and their children? Who knows what the outcome of that will be? So even within capitalism, we have a lot of change. We actually have constant change within capitalism, in fact. We have radical, far-reaching, deep going change all the time. Right? We live in a morally confused world, don't we? Also live in a morally free world, morally pluralistic world in many ways.
So you said the freedom consider nature and then actually like trying to change and after change is transformation, right?
Right.
So
In other
are
words,
we seeing
right.
like what is the like nature point? Like are we seeing current and then just seeing the future after like change, or are we consider after change and we seeing currently right now? Like what is like original
Right.
here? I'm kind of confused about that point.
So nature is what exists. So it's a kind of a moving proposition. And then it becomes actually a function of the present, what we consider original nature to be. Right? So
What is that considered like, okay, their nature revolution?
Mhm.
Is that actually considered?
What do you mean?
Like what is
Oh,
original
change.
nature?
Change within nature. All right, so there's two different kinds of change, we might say. There is, like, the physical universe changes, right? But there's that kind of change, and then there's the change that we can take responsibility for. In other words, if an asteroid hits the Earth now, we can't take responsibility for that, but it would change things. So what can we take responsibility for? Actually something far more destructive, capitalism, which will wreck the world more surely than an asteroid hitting the Earth, actually. Or just as much. Potentially, maybe, I don't know. And we'll live afterwards. We won't be like the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs were pretty fragile. So they died from one meteor strike, Yucatan Peninsula, boom, gone. We'll carry on miserably through the radioactive aftermath of World War III, because that probably will happen, and people will continue to live after that. They will still be tasked with freedom. They'll still be tasked with freedom, right? So nothing exempts us from this task. So there are things that we can't take responsibility for. So if a random wave of gamma radiation emanated from some distant star, like kills us in 30 seconds now, then yeah, that pretty much makes all this moot. But short of that, right, what can we do and what should we do? What ought to be done? What ought to be the case?
So we just have to consider like, is this mean to be consciously? What if then
We're
industrial
conscious.
revolution?
What kind of, the Industrial Revolution? The Industrial Revolution, we did that. We did that.
So after that, like, are we seeing after that as a nature? Because like we're living right now.
Okay, so I mentioned Heidegger, but let's talk about that for a second. Technology, we are part of nature. Technology is part of nature. Nature changes. Again, nature changes by itself. Nature changes through what we can recognize, our conscious activity. Heidegger hated Marxism because he thought Marxism was naive about technology. Right, so Heidegger thought actually technology has far more reaching consequences than Marxism thought. And so therefore, a whole different understanding of nature had to come into play because of what technology revealed about nature and about our condition. And so he's a conservative, meaning he's more circumspect. He's pessimistic, he's less optimistic about these things. He reacted very strongly to the photograph of the Earth from space. He said, this destroys humanity because we're not meant to see ourselves or our planet this way, right? So technology allowed us to see ourselves this way we're not meant to, and we'll never be able to recover spiritually from this, right? So technology escapes our control and has a destructive consequence. Even something seemingly as innocuous as a satellite taking a picture of the Earth from orbit is far more destructive than we even realize, right? So technology is a tricky one because, in fact, from a Marxist perspective, we think that technology is an agent, But that's actually our own self-alienation. And that goes for art too. Art is technology. Art is a technology. And we give these things a kind of subjectivity and agency that they don't really have, that is just our own subjectivity and agency alienated from ourselves. It goes to the heart of the issue of capitalism, what capitalism means. Capitalism is an alienated society. In other words, we treat the laws of capitalism as a force of nature, namely something outside of our control, whereas we're tasked with asserting control over that, not just accepting that and saying, oh, can't do anything about it. Right? That's the idea. One thing that I'll say about my approach to the material we'll be discussing, the stuff that I teach. I have taught Heidegger. Anything that I teach as its advocate. It's a different kind of teaching style than the usual. So I'm the defense attorney for Kant and Hegel and Nietzsche, Lukács, Adorno, meaning I will defend my client at trial. I'll take them on appeal if they're convicted. Take them all the way to the Supreme Court defending them. I'll take them all the way to the pearly gates of heaven and defend them. Right? Why will I do that? Because I want you guys to have the strongest argument in favor of what we're reading. Then it's up to you guys to decide whether it's useful, true, relevant, right? But we're not going to go in with the hermeneutics of suspicion, postmodernism, recur, hermeneutics of suspicion. No, we're gonna treat these as provisionally true in the sense of plausible, in the sense of why did they think this? Why did Kant think the way he did? And also, this stuff has been influential. It's been profoundly influential. It's canonical. And not only for institutional reasons. Not only for institutional reasons. This stuff is rediscovered over and over again. So even when the institution turns against these things, they have a way of coming back. Right? These ideas that are often cited but seldom encountered directly, seldom read. Right? So there's something there. There's something there. And again, I'm going to be making the case for taking this stuff seriously. Taking the philosophy, the dead straight white men. Whoa, they're all dead straight white men, definitely. Here's a little anecdote from the University of Chicago where I got my PhD. So the editor of Critical Inquiry, the journal of Robert Pippin's piece, now I'm forgetting his name. Brown is his last name. What's his first name? It's not Nick Brown, that's somebody else. Anyway, when he found out I was doing a dissertation on Adorno, he said, Chris, I didn't know Adorno was gay, because I'm gay. And I was like, God, I hope he wasn't, right? But the idea was, well, a gay PhD student could only be interested in a thinker if they're gay, right? And, I didn't know Adorno was, no. He's a dead straight white male for sure, right? But no, it's more than that. It's more than that, right? So we're not going to do the hermeneutics of suspicion. We're not going to put like an asterisk on it, or like qualify it. No, this material we're going to be encountering has been profoundly influential around the world. Around the world. Its influence has not been, and not just from institutional inertia, because there has been some truth detected. There's plausibility been detected by women, non-straight people, non-white people, non-Western people. Right. So there's a case. Right? My client has a case. There's a case to be made.
All respect to your client, I'm being a little facetious here, but
yeah.
Foregoing hermeneutics of suspicion strikes me as maybe a little bit anti-Kantian, like leaving criticism aside straight off the gate, leaving an affirmation, giving affirmation without being earned.
Oh, it depends on what one means by critical and criticism. So we'll talk about this next time, but Kant formulated his critical turn in philosophy to overcome Hume's skepticism. Right, so it's formulated to overcome Humean skepticism about theory and about philosophy and about metaphysical claims, metaphysical objects. So for instance, art is a metaphysical object. Freedom is definitely a metaphysical thing, for sure. Society is a metaphysical object. History is a metaphysical object, right? So Hume said these things don't exist. Kant said they do exist, but we have to understand the nature of their existence. So it was meant to overcome that kind of skepticism, which is otherwise endemic and salutary. In other words, that's a moment of enlightenment. Hermeneutics of suspicion, that's recur, right? The masters of suspicion. So the idea that, who are the three masters of suspicion? Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, who are supposedly, according to this postmodernist thinker, Paul Ricoeur, tell us that we should be suspicious of any claim to knowledge by anyone, including most suspicious of any of our own claims to knowing anything. A little bit different from Socrates saying wisdom begins with knowing what you don't know. A little bit different from that. It's got a different edge to it. It's got a nihilistic edge to it. No one would formulate it that way outside of capitalism, quite that way. Right, so it's a little bit different. So critical philosophy, yes, but not mere skepticism. Truth is a metaphysical concept. Truth is a metaphysical concept. Beauty is a metaphysical concept. Morality is a metaphysical concept. The good is a metaphysical concept. Right, so Hume said none of these things exist. Kant says they do exist, but we have to understand the nature of their existence. They don't exist in a Platonic sense or an Aristotelian sense or in a Christian sense, but nonetheless they do exist. Right. But we'll be getting into that. So, I think that also there's a difference between being critical and being cynical. Like, critical doesn't mean skeptical, critical doesn't mean cynical in Kant's sense or in Hegel's sense. And we'll be dealing with Hegel because Hegel's going to be wrestling with Romanticism. He's going to be wrestling with the deep pessimism that's set in with the Romantics and the irony of Romanticism. So these are the things that we'll address. So here's a Descartes kind of idea. So Descartes, cogito ergo sum, and I know that we're supposed to not like Descartes because of mind-body dualism or something. Ugh, such a caricature of Descartes. Descartes, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, does not mean, because it's very important for Kant, does not mean we think ourselves into existence. That's not what it means. It means, what's the one thing I cannot doubt? The one thing I can't doubt is that I'm asking what I can doubt. So that's the one thing I can't doubt, is that I'm asking the question about what I can and cannot doubt. The Kantian version of this is, what's the one thing we can't be skeptical about? Our freedom. Why? Because we're asking the question. In other words, we're asking what freedom is, which is itself a function of our freedom being a reality. So we'll get into it next time with the true, the good, and the beautiful. Namely, that all cultures have had it. All cultures have had notions of the true, the good, and the beautiful. No animal has it. And yet all human cultures have it. Even though all the meaning of such things radically varies across cultures, across history. What is considered true? What is considered good? What is considered beautiful? Yet, everyone thinks that things are true, good, and beautiful. Even if they differ over how they define it, they still have it, notion of it. Right? So that's one thing we can't doubt. Right? We can't doubt the truth because there has never been a human community that didn't have a notion of the truth, ever. Okay. So even if the fundamental truth is that we're asking what is the truth, that still is truth. Right? That's like a truth procedure. All right, but we'll get into it. Like I said, he's going to lay it out in the first sections of the reading for next week, so the preface and the introduction. So I mentioned it's a little bit difficult going at first. You'll get used to reading Kant. This is the easiest of the 3 critiques by Kant to read. So it's a little bit easier than the first critique, the Critique of Pure Reason. Critique of Practical Reason's not too bad either. This one's a little bit easier than the first critique for sure, but it's still, it's translated from German, and the German is written as if it's Latin. So it's got a very strange kind of logical tone to it that might be off-putting, but bear with it. Here's my advice on how to read Kant. So it's repetitive. He comes around, he comes back around. So what that means is that if you find yourself stuck on a sentence, keep going, because he'll explain more, and then he'll reiterate, and he'll come back around. So you'll get it on the second or third time around. So I compare it to crossing a creek where you have to jump from stone to stone. Did you do this as children ever? No? Are the children too protected now? Are you allowed to fall into the creek anymore? Right? So if you go too fast, you'll fall. If you go too slow, you'll fall. Right? So you have to go at the optimum speed in order to not lose your footing, not lose your balance. Go from stone to stone. Right? So it is a little bit like that with Kant. You can't read it too fast, and you can't read it too slow. So you have to sort of find the optimal speed with which to read it so that you don't fall in the water. You don't fall between the stones. Because if you don't catch something, you'll have another opportunity. Right? So don't get stuck in any given sentence. That's a pitfall to the Kant. So it'll be a little unique in our readings, actually. Like other readings that we have in this course are difficult, but in a different way from the way Kant is difficult. All right, I think that's it for today, for this week. So I'll look forward to seeing you guys next time.